The gown landed at Alara's feet like an insult thrown across the room. "Wear that," Margaret said, her voice cold and final. "It is the only one you will get." Alara bent down and picked it up. The fabric was torn at the shoulder, faded from years of use, and smelled faintly of the attic where it had been stored. She did not argue. Arguing had never once changed anything in this house. "The carriage leaves in 1 hour," Margaret continued, turning back to the mirror where Charlotte stood glowing in blue silk. "You will attend as a servant tonight, not as a guest. Do you understand me, Alara? You will carry trays, refill glasses, and stay near the walls. If I see you speaking to anyone of importance, you will regret it." "Yes, Margaret," Alara said quietly. Charlotte glanced at her stepsister in the mirror's reflection, her expression flickering with something that might have been guilt, though it vanished as quickly as it came. She said nothing. She never did. Alara carried the ragged gown up the narrow stairs to the small room she had once shared with no one, back when her father was alive and this house still felt like home. Now it felt like a place she was allowed to sleep in, nothing more. She laid the gown across her bed and looked at it for a long moment. 3 years. 3 years since her father's carriage accident. 3 years since Margaret had stopped pretending to care what happened to her late husband's daughter. In that time, Alara had learned to disappear. She kept her head down, did the mending, and asked for nothing. It was easier that way, easier than hoping. She changed into the gown slowly. It did not fit her properly. It had belonged to a housemaid who left the household 2 winters ago, and it hung loose at the waist and short at the ankle. Alara looked at herself in the small, spotted mirror propped against the wall and felt nothing. She had trained herself not to feel much of anything when it came to how she looked, how she was treated, or what she was worth in this house. A soft knock came at her door. "Alara." It was Nathaniel's voice, low and careful. She opened the door to find him standing there, his cap in his hands, his eyes taking in the state of her dress before he could stop himself. His jaw tightened. "She is sending you like this," he said. It was not a question. "It does not matter," Alara said. "It matters to me." She almost smiled at that. Nathaniel had been the steward's son for as long as she could remember, and in all these years, he had never once looked away when others did. He brought her books when Margaret forbade her from the library. He left food outside her door on the nights she was made to go without supper. He never asked for anything in return, and that, more than anything, was why she trusted him. "I have something," he said, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a small shawl, plain but clean, a deep green that had clearly been carefully kept. "It was my mother's. It will not fix the dress, but it will keep you warm, and it is not torn." Alara took it carefully, running her fingers over the fabric. "Nathaniel, I cannot take this." "You can, and you will." His voice was firm, though gentle. "Tonight of all nights, you should not have to feel the cold on top of everything else." She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of lavender, and for a moment, standing in that narrow doorway, she felt something close to comfort. "Thank you," she said. "You do not have to thank me for every small thing," Nathaniel said, a note of frustration slipping into his voice. "You deserve far more than a borrowed shawl, Alara. You deserve a place at that ball tonight that is not spent carrying trays for people who will not remember your face by morning." Alara looked away, toward the small window where the last light of evening was fading into blue. "Wishing does not change what is real, Nathaniel. I learned that a long time ago." "Perhaps," he said, "but it does not mean you should stop hoping entirely." She did not answer that. There was nothing safe to say to it. Hope, in this house, had always been a costly thing, and she had spent whatever she once had of it on nights that ended in disappointment. It was easier, safer, to expect nothing at all. "Do not thank me, just be careful tonight. Margaret is in a strange mood. I do not like the way she has been speaking about the ball, about the Duke." Alara's brow furrowed. "The Duke?" "Duke Alaric Vane. He is expected to attend tonight, and half the mothers in the county have been preparing their daughters for months. Margaret has convinced herself that Charlotte will catch his eye." Nathaniel paused. "She will not let anything, or anyone, get in the way of that." Alara understood the warning beneath his words. She nodded once and said nothing more. The carriage ride to the Vane estate was silent except for Charlotte's occasional sighs about her hair, her gloves, her nerves. Alara sat pressed against the window, watching the dark countryside roll past, the shawl pulled tight around her. Margaret did not look at her once during the entire journey, as though she had already decided Alara did not exist for the evening. When they arrived, the estate rose before them like something from a story Alara used to read as a child, before her father died. before the stories stopped being told to her at all. Golden light spilled from every window, carriages lined the drive, and laughter drifted out into the cold night air. For one brief, foolish moment, Alara let herself imagine walking through the front doors as a guest, not as someone meant to disappear into the background. Then Margaret's hand closed around her wrist. "The servants' entrance," Margaret said. "Now." Alara was led around the side of the grand house to a smaller door, where a harried butler handed her a tray of drinks without so much as a glance at her face. She fell into place among the other serving staff, her ragged gown and Nathaniel's shawl standing out among their neat, matching uniforms. A few of the other maids gave her sympathetic looks, but no one spoke. There was no time. The ball had already begun. The ballroom, when she finally stepped into it carrying her tray, took her breath away despite everything. Chandeliers blazed overhead, throwing light across a sea of silk and jewels. Musicians played from a raised platform, and couples turned across the polished floor in perfect, practiced steps. Alara kept to the edges as instructed, offering drinks with lowered eyes, careful never to let her gaze linger too long on any one face. She caught sight of Charlotte across the room, laughing brightly at something a young gentleman had said, Margaret hovering nearby like a hawk watching its prize. For a moment, Alara felt nothing but tired relief that she was not the one expected to charm strangers tonight. Being invisible, she thought, had its small mercies. It was near the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom that she first saw him. He stood slightly apart from a cluster of eager guests, his expression polite but distant, the kind of look worn by someone who had perfected the art of appearing present while being anywhere else in his mind. He was tall, dressed in dark, well-tailored clothing that made no attempt to compete with the room's excess, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested he would rather be elsewhere entirely. A woman beside Alara, one of the other serving girls, whispered, "That is him." The Duke. Alara did not mean to look for as long as she did. She turned quickly back to her tray, weaving through the crowd, offering drinks to guests who barely acknowledged her presence. She told herself it did not matter who he was. Dukes did not notice girls in borrowed shawls and torn hems. Dukes married daughters like Charlotte, daughters with proper gowns and proper names attached to proper fortunes. She was reaching to refill an empty glass near the edge of the dance floor when a sudden movement sent the tray tilting sharply in her hands. Wine splashed across the floor, and gasps rippled through the nearby guests. Alara froze, horrified, already imagining Margaret's fury. "Careful," said a low voice beside her, steadying the tray before it could fall entirely. She looked up, and her breath caught. It was him, the Duke, close enough now that she could see his eyes were a clear, striking gray, and that his polite mask had shifted, just slightly, into something more curious. "I am so sorry, Your Grace," Alara said quickly, stepping back, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "It will not happen again." "It was hardly your fault," he said, glancing at the guest whose careless step had caused the spill. "You were simply standing where someone else was clumsy." Alara did not know what to say to that. No one at these events ever stopped to assign blame fairly when it came to the serving staff. She murmured another apology and began to turn away, eager to disappear back into the crowd, before Margaret noticed the small disturbance. "Wait," the Duke said. She stopped, startled, and turned back to face him. "You are not one of the household staff," he said, studying her with quiet attention. "I know most of the family names in this county, and I do not know yours." Alara's heart beat faster. She thought of Margaret's warning, of the danger in being seen, in being spoken to, in existing too loudly in a room where she was meant to remain invisible. "I am no one of consequence, Your Grace," she said carefully. "Simply here to serve." Something flickered across his face, something she could not quite name. He glanced down at the shawl around her shoulders, then back at her face, and for a moment, it seemed as though he saw far more than she wanted him to. "I doubt that," he said quietly. Before Alara could respond, a familiar voice cut sharply through the space between them. "Alara." Margaret was approaching fast, her smile fixed and furious beneath its polished surface. Alara felt her stomach drop. Whatever had just happened between herself and the Duke, whatever strange, unguarded moment had passed between them, she knew it was about to end very badly. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Margaret said smoothly, inserting herself between them with practiced grace. "This girl has clearly forgotten her duties. Alara, the kitchens need you at once." Alara did not miss the warning buried in those words. She bowed her head and turned to go, but not before she felt the Duke's gaze follow her across the room, steady and unreadable. long after she had disappeared back into the crowd of servants near the far wall. In the kitchens, the air was thick with heat and the clatter of dishes. Alara set down her tray and pressed her back against the cool stone wall for just a moment, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands were still trembling, though she could not say whether it was from the fear of Margaret's anger or from something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for. One of the older kitchen maids, a kind woman named Beatrice who had worked in the household for years, glanced at her with a knowing look. "You spoke with the Duke," she said, not quite a question. "He spoke to me," Alara corrected softly. "There is a difference." "Not to men like him there is not," Beatrice said, wiping her hands on her apron. "A man like that does not waste his words on someone he does not care to notice. Mark me, girl. He noticed you." Alara shook her head, though her heart beat a little faster at the words. "It does not matter if he did. Nothing will come of it. Margaret will make certain of that." "Margaret cannot control everything," Beatrice said, though even she did not sound entirely convinced. Alara picked up another tray, forcing her thoughts back to the work in front of her. She could not afford to dwell on a few strange minutes beside the dance floor, on gray eyes that had looked at her as though she were something more than a shadow in a borrowed shawl. Whatever had passed between them, it would end here, in the kitchens, where she belonged tonight. She told herself this firmly, again and again, as she carried the tray back out into the noise and light of the ballroom, determined not to look toward the tall windows where she had last seen him standing. She did not entirely succeed. The ballroom grew warmer as the night wore on, filled now with the scent of candle wax, perfume, and spilled wine. Alara moved through the crowd with her tray, her feet aching inside shoes that did not quite fit, her mind still circling back, again and again, to a pair of gray eyes that had looked at her as though she were worth seeing. She scolded herself each time the thought returned. Nothing good could come of it. She had learned long ago that wanting things, even small things, only made their absence hurt more. Across the room, Charlotte was laughing loudly at something a young gentleman had said, her cheeks flushed with wine and attention. Margaret stood nearby, her eyes sweeping the room like a general surveying a battlefield, searching for any sign of the Duke's location, calculating how best to place her daughter in his path. Alara kept her head down and continued her work. She refilled glasses. She collected empty plates. She murmured polite nothings when guests barely glanced her way. It was, in its own strange fashion, easier than she expected. The crowd's indifference wrapped around her like a second shawl, and for long stretches of time, she nearly forgot to feel the sting of it. At one point she passed close to where Charlotte stood surrounded by admirers, and she overheard her stepsister's bright, practiced laugh, the kind reserved for men worth impressing. Charlotte caught her eye for just a moment, and something unreadable passed across her face before she turned back to her conversation. It was not unkindness, not exactly. It was something closer to discomfort, as though even Charlotte, wrapped in silk and flattery, could not quite look at her stepsister without feeling the weight of what separated them tonight. Alara moved on before either of them had to decide what to do with that shared glance. Near the refreshment table she paused to refill her tray, watching the dancers turn beneath the chandeliers. She thought, not for the first time that evening, of her father, of how he used to speak of balls he had attended in his youth, of music and laughter, and the particular magic of a room lit entirely by candlelight. He had promised, once, that he would take her to such an evening when she was old enough. He had not lived to keep that promise, and Margaret had made certain, in the years since, that Alara understood exactly how little that old promise meant now. She pushed the thought away and lifted her tray again, weaving carefully through the crowd, her feet beginning to ache in earnest now that the hour had grown late. Then, near the edge of the room, close to a set of tall doors leading out to a stone terrace, she felt a presence beside her that made her pulse quicken before she even turned her head. "You disappeared rather quickly," Duke Alaric Vane said. Alara turned, startled, nearly losing her grip on the tray a second time. "Your Grace, I did not mean to keep you waiting." "You did not," he said. "I simply noticed you were gone, and then I noticed I was looking for you, which struck me as an odd thing to admit to a stranger." She did not know how to answer that. No one at these events spoke to her so plainly, so without the careful distance that separated guests from servants. She glanced quickly around the room, half expecting Margaret to appear out of nowhere and pull her away again. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but I should return to my duties," she said. "I am not meant to linger." "And if I asked you to linger anyway?" The question hung between them, simple and direct, and something in his tone told her it was not spoken carelessly. Alara studied his face for a moment, searching for mockery or pity, the two things she had learned to expect from men of his standing. She found neither. "That would be a very unusual request," she said carefully. "I am told I am not a very usual man," he replied, and for the first time that evening, something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Walk with me, just to the terrace. No one will think it strange for a guest to request a moment of air, and no one will think it strange for staff to attend them there." It was, Ilara realized, a clever excuse, one that gave her cover even as it pulled her further from where Margaret expected her to be. She hesitated only a moment before setting her tray on a nearby table and following him toward the terrace doors. The night air outside was cool and sharp after the heat of the ballroom, carrying the scent of late autumn leaves and distant wood smoke. Lanterns lined the stone railing, casting a soft golden light over the garden below. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Ilara found herself grateful simply to breathe without the noise of the crowd pressing in around her. "You are not from a household I recognize," Alaric said finally, turning to study her with the same quiet attention he had shown earlier. "And yet you carry yourself as though you have attended 100 balls before tonight, not served at them." Alara's chest tightened. "I do not know what you mean, Your Grace." "I mean," he said, "that most serving staff keep their eyes lowered and their shoulders bowed. You do neither, not entirely, even when you try. There is something in the way you speak, the way you stand, that does not match the tray in your hands." She looked away, toward the dark shapes of the garden hedges below. "Appearances can be deceiving." "They can," he agreed, "which is precisely why I find myself curious about yours." Ilara wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly exposed under his careful gaze. "My name is Ilara Whitmore," she said finally, deciding there was little harm in at least that much truth. "My father was a gentleman of modest means. He died 3 years ago. Since then, I have lived in my stepmother's household, where I am considered useful, in whatever capacity she requires." Something shifted in Alaric's expression, a flicker of understanding that told her he had heard enough stories like hers to recognize the shape of it, even without every detail. "Whitmore," he repeated slowly. "Margaret Whitmore is your stepmother. You know her." "I know of her," he said, careful not to reveal more than that. "And I know the young woman she has been eager for me to meet this evening is not, I think, standing before me now in a serving girl's shawl." Ilara's breath caught. She had not expected him to piece together so much so quickly. "Charlotte is her daughter," she said. "It is Charlotte you were meant to meet tonight." "So I gathered." His gray eyes did not leave her face. "And yet here I am, on a terrace, speaking with someone else entirely." Neither of them said anything for a long moment. The music from the ballroom drifted faintly through the doors behind them, soft and distant, as though it belonged to another world. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" Ilara said finally, surprising herself with her own boldness. "You may." "Why does it matter to you who I am or where I come from? You have a room full of guests inside, all eager for your attention. Any one of them would gladly stand here in my place." Alaric considered the question seriously, as though it deserved more than a quick or practiced answer. "Because most of them are performing," he said at last. "Every smile calculated, every laugh timed to land just so. I have spent years learning to see through it, and it grows tiresome, watching a room full of people say everything except what they actually mean. You have not performed for me once tonight. Even when you were frightened of being caught speaking with me, you did not pretend otherwise." "Perhaps I simply have less practice at performing," Ilara said. "Servants are rarely taught the art of pleasant lies." "Then perhaps that is exactly why I prefer this conversation to any other I have had this evening." He paused, studying the lantern light flickering across the stone railing. "Tell me something true then, something you would not say to anyone else in that ballroom tonight." Ilara considered the request carefully. It would have been easy to deflect, to offer some harmless observation and retreat back into safety, but something about the quiet honesty of the night and the unexpected kindness in his voice loosened something in her chest that had been tightly held for a very long time. "I am tired," she said softly. "Not simply tonight, though I am that too. I mean tired in a way that goes deeper than sleep can fix. Tired of being useful instead of wanted. Tired of disappearing so well that even I sometimes forget what it felt like to be seen." The words hung in the cool night air between them, more honest than she had intended to be. She almost regretted them the moment they left her mouth, certain they would sound foolish or overly dramatic to a man who had likely never once in his life felt invisible. Instead, Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the lantern light. "That is not foolish," he said, as though he had heard the doubt she had not spoken aloud. It is one of the more honest things anyone has said to me in a very long time. And you, Your Grace? Since we are trading honesty tonight. A faint, wry smile touched his mouth. I am tired of being courted for a title rather than for myself. Every young woman in that ballroom sees a duke before she sees a man. I have grown so used to it that I nearly forgot what it felt like to be asked a question without calculation behind it, until tonight. Elara studied him for a moment, this tall, guarded man who had somehow found his way to the same quiet, lonely corner of the evening that she occupied. It struck her, suddenly, how strange and fragile this moment was. Two people from entirely different worlds, meeting briefly in the space between duty and desire, neither quite certain what to do with what they had found. You should go back inside, Your Grace, Elara said eventually, though the words felt heavier than she wanted them to. If Margaret discovers you have been speaking with me instead of Charlotte, there will be consequences. Not for you, for me. What sort of consequences? Elara hesitated. She did not want to sound as though she were seeking pity, and she certainly did not want to burden a duke with the small, grinding cruelties of her daily life. It does not matter, she said instead. It is simply better if I am not seen lingering here. Alaric studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling sense that he understood far more than she had said aloud. Very well, he said finally. I will not keep you from your duties any longer than I already have, but I find I am not finished with this conversation, Miss Whitmore. The formal address, spoken with such quiet sincerity, struck her somewhere deep and unguarded. No one addressed her that way anymore. In this house, she was simply Elara, or worse, she was nothing at all. A name spoken only when there was work to be assigned. Thank you for your kindness tonight, Your Grace, she said softly. It has been unexpected. Kindness should not be unexpected, he said, but I understand why in your case it might be. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her once more. Elara. It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the way he said it, careful and deliberate, sent a small, foolish warmth through her chest. Yes, Your Grace? Save a dance for me. Later, when the crowd is thinner and Margaret's attention is elsewhere, I would very much like to properly speak with you again before this night ends. Elara's heart pounded against her ribs. It was a reckless thing to promise, and she knew it even as the words left her mouth. I will try, Your Grace. I cannot promise more than that. Try is enough, he said, for now. She slipped back through the terrace doors and into the noise and heat of the ballroom, her mind spinning with everything that had just passed between them. She found her tray where she had left it and resumed her work, though her thoughts remained fixed on gray eyes and a voice that had spoken her name as though it mattered. Across the room, she caught sight of Charlotte glancing anxiously toward the terrace doors, clearly having noticed the Duke's absence and wondering where he had gone. Margaret stood beside her daughter, her expression sharp and calculating, scanning the crowd with the focused intensity of a woman who sensed something had shifted, even if she could not yet name what it was. Elara kept her eyes on her tray and said nothing. Whatever had happened on that terrace, whatever strange and fragile thing had begun to take shape between herself and a duke who was meant for someone else entirely, she knew it would not stay hidden for long. Margaret's instincts for trouble were sharper than most, and tonight, for the first time in years, Elara had given her a reason to look closely at the girl she had spent so long trying to make invisible. She continued through the crowd, offering drinks with steady hands despite the storm building quietly beneath her calm expression, and waited to see how long her small, borrowed moment of hope would last before the night demanded its price. Behind her, unseen, Nathaniel stood near the servants' entrance, watching the way the Duke's gaze occasionally drifted toward Elara across the crowded room. He said nothing to anyone, but something in his chest tightened at the sight, a feeling he could not quite name and did not have the right to claim. He had loved Elara quietly for years, without ever expecting anything in return, content simply to watch over her from the edges of her life. Tonight, for the first time, he wondered whether the world might finally be preparing to notice what he had seen in her all along, and whether there would be any place left for him in whatever came next. He pushed the thought aside and returned to his duties, telling himself that her happiness, whatever shape it took, mattered more than his own quiet hopes ever could. Margaret found out within the hour. It was not through careful investigation, but through the careless whisper of another guest, a woman named Lady Winslow who had watched the Duke disappear onto the terrace and return alone some minutes later, his expression unusually thoughtful for a man who rarely showed anything at all. Your stepdaughter, the woman said to Margaret not unkindly, simply making conversation, seemed to catch the Duke's attention earlier. I saw them speaking near the terrace doors. Margaret's smile did not falter, but something behind her eyes turned to ice. "I am sure you are mistaken," she said smoothly. "Elara is here only to assist with the serving staff tonight." "Perhaps," the woman said, already losing interest and turning back to the dance floor. Still, it did look rather like a private conversation. Margaret excused herself a moment later, weaving through the crowd with the fixed, pleasant expression she wore like armor, searching until she found Elara near the refreshment table, quietly refilling glasses as though nothing at all had happened. "A word," Margaret said, her voice low and sharp, gripping Elara's elbow and steering her toward a quiet alcove behind a row of tall curtains. "Margaret, please, my tray." "Leave the tray." Margaret's fingers tightened. Once they were hidden from the main crowd, her carefully pleasant expression dropped away entirely, replaced by something colder and far more familiar to Elara. "What did you say to him?" "To whom?" "Do not play games with me, Elara. The Duke. I am told you spoke with him on the terrace, alone." Elara kept her voice steady, though her heart pounded hard against her ribs. "He asked me a question. I answered it. That is all that happened. That is not all that happened, and we both know it." Margaret's eyes narrowed, studying her stepdaughter's face as though searching for the lie she was certain must be hiding there. "You will stay away from him for the remainder of this evening. Do you understand me? Whatever foolish idea has taken root in your head tonight, you will let it go now, before it costs you far more than you can afford to lose." "I did nothing wrong," Elara said quietly, though there was a new thread of steel in her voice that had not been there before, one that surprised even her. "I answered honestly when a guest spoke to me. That is not a crime, Margaret." "It is a mistake," Margaret hissed. "A dangerous one. Charlotte has spent months preparing for this season, for this exact opportunity, and I will not allow some passing curiosity on the Duke's part to undo everything I have worked toward. Do you understand what will happen to this household if Charlotte does not marry well? Do you understand what will happen to you?" The threat, though unspoken directly, landed exactly as Margaret intended. Elara understood perfectly well what her life would become if Margaret's plans for Charlotte failed. She was already treated as little more than unpaid labor in this house, without even the pretense of family obligation holding her stepmother's cruelty in check. There would be nothing left to soften the years ahead. "Do you think I enjoy this?" Margaret said suddenly, her voice dropping lower, something almost weary creeping into it. "Do you think it brings me any pleasure, speaking to you this way? I have a household to protect, Elara. Charlotte's future is the only thing standing between this family and ruin, and I will not let sentiment or foolish girlish hope stand in the way of securing it." "I never asked to stand in the way of anything," Elara said quietly. "I never asked for any of this, Margaret. Not tonight, and not these past 3 years." For the briefest moment, something like doubt flickered across Margaret's face, quickly smothered before it could fully surface. "Life does not care what we ask for," she said, her voice hardening again. "It only cares what we are willing to do to survive it. You would do well to remember that." "I will stay away from him," Elara said finally, though the words tasted like ash. "I promise." Margaret studied her for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception, before finally releasing her grip. "See that you do. And Elara, I want you gone from this ball within the hour. You have served your purpose tonight. Beatrice will drive you home. But the evening is not yet over. It is over for you." Margaret's voice left no room for argument. "Go and find Edmund. Tell him I have arranged for the carriage to take you home early. I will not have you lingering here a moment longer than necessary." Elara opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. There was no version of this conversation in which arguing would improve her situation. She nodded once, stiffly, and turned to make her way toward the servants' entrance, her chest tight with a strange, aching disappointment she had no right to feel. She had not gone more than a few steps when a familiar figure intercepted her path. "Elara." Nathaniel's voice was low, urgent. "What happened? You look pale." "Margaret is sending me home early," Elara said, keeping her voice steady with effort. "She discovered I spoke with the Duke." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, a flash of quiet anger crossing his features before he mastered it. "That is not fair. You did nothing wrong." "Fairness has very little to do with anything in this house, Nathaniel. You know that as well as I do." He glanced over her shoulder, toward where Margaret now stood beside Charlotte, adjusting her daughter's gloves and murmuring instructions Elara could not hear. Something in Nathaniel's expression shifted, thoughtful and determined. "Wait here," he said. "Just a few minutes. Let me see what I can arrange." "Nathaniel, there is nothing to arrange. Margaret has made her decision." "Margaret does not control everything that happens in this house tonight," he said, and before Elara could stop him, he had slipped away into the crowd, moving with quiet purpose toward the household's driver, a heavy-set man named Edmund who had worked for the family for over a decade and had always shown Alara small, quiet kindnesses of his own. Alara waited near the edge of the room, uncertain what Nathaniel intended and unwilling to hope too much that it would change anything. She watched the dancers turn beneath the chandeliers, watched Charlotte laugh brightly at something Margaret had said, watched the whole glittering scene continue exactly as it always did, indifferent to the quiet crisis unfolding at its edges. Charlotte, for her part, was not laughing as freely as she appeared. Beneath the polished smile she wore for the benefit of the room, her thoughts kept drifting to the sight of her stepsister slipping away toward the terrace earlier, and to the strange, unreadable look that had crossed the Duke's face when he returned. She had spent months preparing for this evening, memorizing steps and practicing pleasant conversation, all under her mother's watchful instruction. Yet some small, honest part of her wondered whether any of it would matter if the Duke's attention had already settled elsewhere. She glanced toward the servants near the far wall, searching for Alara's face among them, and felt an unfamiliar twist of guilt she did not have the words to explain. It was not something she allowed herself to examine too closely. Guilt was inconvenient, and her mother had taught her, in 100 small ways over the years, that inconvenient feelings were best set aside in favor of duty. "Smile, Charlotte," Margaret murmured beside her, adjusting the lace at her daughter's wrist. "The Duke will return shortly, and you must look as though nothing in this room could possibly trouble you." Charlotte obeyed, as she always did, though the smile did not quite reach her eyes. Nathaniel returned a few minutes later, his expression carefully composed. "Edmund has agreed to delay the carriage," he said quietly. "He will tell Margaret there is trouble with one of the wheels, something that will take an hour or more to repair properly. It will buy you time." "Time for what, Nathaniel?" "Margaret has already told me to stay away from the Duke for the rest of the evening. What good does an extra hour do me?" "I do not know," he admitted, "but I could not simply let her send you away without trying something. You deserve at least the chance to see how tonight ends, whatever that turns out to mean." Alara looked at him for a long moment, struck again by the quiet, steady loyalty he had shown her for so many years, asking for nothing in return. "Thank you," she said softly. "I do not know what I would do without you watching over me." Something flickered across Nathaniel's face, quickly hidden. "You would manage," he said. "You are stronger than you know, Alara. You always have been." Before she could respond, a stir moved through the crowd near the ballroom's entrance, and Alara turned to see Duke Alaric making his way through the guests, his expression focused and searching, as though looking for someone in particular. Margaret noticed him at nearly the same moment and moved quickly to intercept him, pulling Charlotte along by the arm. "Your Grace," Margaret said warmly, her voice pitched to carry just enough for those nearby to hear. "May I present my daughter Charlotte? She has been most eager to make your acquaintance this evening." Charlotte curtsied gracefully, offering a bright smile that had clearly been practiced for exactly this moment. "Your Grace, it is an honor." Alaric offered a polite bow in return, his expression courteous but distant, the same practiced mask Alara had seen him wearing earlier in the evening, before their conversation on the terrace. "Miss Whitmore," he said evenly, "a pleasure." "I understand you enjoy music, Your Grace," Charlotte said brightly, exactly as she had rehearsed. "Perhaps you might favor me with the next dance." "Perhaps," Alaric said, his tone polite but non-committal, his gaze already beginning to drift across the room, searching, though he did not appear to realize he was doing it. Margaret noticed the direction of his attention and stepped subtly to block his view, drawing his focus back toward Charlotte with a well-practiced comment about the evening's music. For a moment it seemed as though the encounter might proceed exactly as Margaret had planned it, months of careful preparation finally paying their intended reward. Charlotte spoke pleasantly of the season's other gatherings, and Alaric responded with the polished, careful courtesy expected of a man in his position, giving no outward sign of the restlessness Alara alone had glimpsed beneath his composed exterior. Alara watched from a distance, her chest tight with an emotion she did not want to examine too closely. This was, after all, exactly how the evening was always meant to unfold. Charlotte, in her fine blue silk, meeting the Duke properly, as intended, while Alara remained at the edges, exactly where Margaret insisted she belonged. She turned to go, telling herself firmly that this was for the best, that whatever strange, fragile connection she had felt on the terrace had been nothing more than a passing curiosity on the Duke's part, easily replaced by a more suitable match. Alara. She froze at the sound of her name, spoken clearly across the distance between them. She turned back to find Alaric's gaze fixed directly on her, even as Charlotte stood beside him, her smile faltering slightly in confusion. "Your Grace?" Margaret's voice carried a note of forced pleasantness, though her eyes had gone sharp and wary. "Forgive me," Alaric said, his attention still not leaving Alara's face. "I believe I promised someone a dance earlier this evening, before I was called away. I intend to keep that promise now, if she is willing." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the nearby guests. Margaret's expression cracked, just slightly, before she recovered her composure. "Your Grace, surely you are mistaken. Alara is part of the serving staff tonight, not a guest deserving of your attention." "I am rarely mistaken about such things," Alaric said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. He crossed the distance between them, stopping before Alara with a formal, respectful bow that drew even more startled looks from the surrounding crowd. "Miss Whitmore, would you do me the honor of this dance?" Alara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone nearby must be able to hear it. She glanced past him, toward Margaret's furious, carefully controlled expression, toward Charlotte's stunned confusion, toward the dozens of curious eyes now turned in her direction. For one long moment, she hesitated, caught between the safety of retreat and the terrifying pull of possibility. She thought of Margaret's warning, still fresh in her ears, of the quiet threat buried beneath every word her stepmother had spoken tonight. She thought of the years that had taught her caution above all else, the careful, practiced art of making herself small enough to avoid notice, small enough to avoid punishment. Every instinct she had built over 3 long years urged her to lower her eyes, to apologize, to retreat quietly back into the safety of the crowd where no one expected anything of her at all. But beneath that old familiar caution, something else stirred, something she had nearly forgotten how to recognize. It was the same feeling Nathaniel's kindness had stirred earlier that evening, small and stubborn and refusing to be silenced entirely, no matter how many times she tried to bury it. It was hope, fragile and unfamiliar, and for the first time in a very long while, she found she did not want to extinguish it simply because it frightened her. Nearby, Nathaniel watched the entire exchange with his breath held, his hands curled tightly at his sides. Whatever happened next, he understood he had no claim to interfere, no right to step between Alara and whatever choice she was about to make. He could only watch, and hope, quietly, that the world was finally about to treat her with the fairness she had always deserved and so rarely received. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The music began again, and as Alaric led her onto the floor, past Margaret's rigid, furious stillness and Charlotte's wide, disbelieving eyes, Alara understood, with sudden and startling clarity, that whatever happened next, tonight would not end quietly, and there would be no returning to the safe, invisible corners she had spent 3 years learning to occupy. The other dancers made room for them, a ripple of surprised glances and lowered whispers spreading outward across the floor as guests realized who the Duke had chosen for his dance. Alara felt the weight of every eye upon her, felt the familiar urge to shrink beneath it, and forced herself instead to stand a little taller, to meet Alaric's steady gaze rather than looking away. "You are trembling," he said quietly, as they began to move together in time with the music. "I am terrified, Your Grace," she admitted. "I do not know the steps to this particular dance, in more ways than one." A faint smile touched his mouth. "Then allow me to lead. I promise I will not let you stumble." They moved together across the polished floor, and slowly, gradually, Alara felt some of her fear ease, replaced by something quieter and steadier, a strange sense of rightness she had no explanation for. The ballroom around them seemed to blur at the edges, the music and light and whispered gossip fading into something distant and unimportant, leaving only the two of them and the careful, deliberate rhythm of the dance. Across the floor, Margaret stood frozen, her carefully constructed composure cracking further with every passing moment. Beside her, Charlotte watched with an expression that mixed disbelief with something else, something that might almost have been relief, though she could not yet name why. "This cannot be happening," Margaret murmured, more to herself than to anyone nearby. "This cannot be allowed to continue." She began moving through the crowd with renewed determination, already calculating how best to intervene, how best to salvage what remained of her carefully laid plans for the evening. Whatever strange connection had sprung up between the Duke and her overlooked stepdaughter, Margaret was not prepared to let it continue unchallenged, not when so much depended on tonight, unfolding exactly as she had intended. But for the moment at least, the dance continued, and Alara allowed herself, just this once, to exist fully within it, without fear, without apology, without the constant, exhausting need to make herself smaller than she was. The dance ended, but the whispers that followed did not. Alara felt them everywhere as Alaric led her from the floor, curious glances and murmured questions passing between guests who could not quite believe what they had witnessed. A servant girl, dancing with a duke, in full view of the entire assembly. It was the kind of scandal that would fuel gossip for weeks to come, and Alara knew it, even as she tried to keep her expression calm. "Thank you for the dance, Your Grace," she said quietly, already preparing to slip back toward the safety of the crowd's edges. "Alara," his voice stopped her. "I am not finished speaking with you tonight." Before she could respond, Margaret arrived, her composure restored to something dangerously smooth, though Alara could see the fury still simmering beneath it. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but I really must borrow my stepdaughter. There is a matter in the kitchens requiring her immediate attention." "The matter can wait," Alaric said, his tone polite but unmistakably firm. "I find I would like a few more minutes of Miss Whitmore's company, if she is willing to give it." Margaret's smile tightened at the corners. "Your Grace, I must insist. Alara has duties to attend to." "And I must insist otherwise," Alaric replied evenly. "I am, after all, a guest in whatever household hosts this evening, and I believe my wishes carry some small weight here." The words were spoken lightly, but there was steel beneath them, and Margaret seemed to recognize she had little room to argue further without drawing more attention than she wished. She retreated, though not without a final, sharp glance in Alara's direction, one that promised further conversation once the Duke's attention had moved elsewhere. Alaric guided Alara toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the densest cluster of guests. "You seemed troubled during our dance," he said, "more than simple nerves." "Margaret does not approve of tonight's events," Alara admitted. "I fear I will pay for them once we return home." Something dark passed across Alaric's expression. "Pay for them how?" Alara hesitated, unwilling to voice the specifics of what her life in Margaret's household actually looked like. The long hours, the constant scrutiny, the quiet cruelties that never quite crossed into anything she could formally protest. "It does not matter, Your Grace. I have managed for 3 years. I will manage a little longer." "It matters to me," he said, echoing, without knowing it, the very words Nathaniel had spoken to her earlier that evening. "I do not like the idea of you returning to a place where kindness is treated as a punishable offense." "You barely know me, Your Grace," Alara said softly. "It seems a great deal to promise on the strength of a single conversation and a single dance." "Perhaps," Alaric admitted, "but I have found that the things worth knowing about a person often reveal themselves quickly, if one is paying proper attention. You have shown me honesty when it would have been easier to hide, and courage when silence would have been safer. That tells me more than a dozen polite seasons of careful courtship ever could." Alara felt her cheeks warm despite herself. "You make it sound simple." "It is not simple," he said, "but it is, I think, true." Before Alara could respond, a new voice interrupted them, cool and deliberately pitched to Carrie. "Your Grace, might I have a private word?" Alara turned to find a woman she did not recognize approaching, elegant and sharp-eyed, dressed in deep violet silk that marked her as someone of considerable standing. Beside her stood Margaret, her expression carefully arranged into something like concern. "Lady Pemberton," Alaric said, his tone shifting into something more guarded. "Of course." The woman's gaze flicked toward Alara, assessing and cool. "I understand this young woman has been receiving a great deal of your attention this evening. I feel it only right to mention, Your Grace, that there are certain concerns regarding her character that you may wish to be aware of, before matters proceed any further." Alara's stomach dropped. "What concerns?" Lady Pemberton did not look at her directly, addressing Alaric instead as though Alara were not present at all. "It is said the girl has a history of forming inappropriate attachments with gentlemen above her station, seeking their favor through means that are not entirely honest. Her own stepmother has expressed concern over the matter on more than one occasion, has she not, Margaret?" Margaret's expression flickered with something that might have been discomfort, quickly smoothed away. "I have never wished to speak ill of Alara publicly," she said carefully, her tone suggesting the exact opposite of her words. "But I cannot in good conscience allow the Duke to proceed without understanding the full situation." "This is a lie," Alara said, her voice sharper than she intended, cutting through the careful, poisonous performance unfolding around her. "I have never sought anyone's favor through dishonest means. I have done nothing tonight, except answer honestly when spoken to." "Of course you would say that," Lady Pemberton said smoothly. "It would hardly serve your interests to admit otherwise." Alaric's expression had grown increasingly still throughout the exchange, unreadable in a way that made Alara's chest tighten with dread. Had the lie already done its work? Had a few carefully chosen words undone whatever fragile connection had formed between them over the course of the evening? I have known Alara for the span of a single evening, Alaric said finally, his voice measured and calm. In that time I have found her to be direct, honest, and entirely without the calculated performance I have grown so tired of encountering in this room tonight. I find myself far more inclined to trust my own judgment than a claim delivered second-hand, without evidence, by someone who has known her for considerably less time than I have. Lady Pemberton's composure flickered, clearly unprepared for the pushback. Your Grace, I only meant to offer a word of caution. And I appreciate the concern, Alaric said, though his tone made clear he appreciated no such thing. But I believe I am capable of forming my own judgments about character, Lady Pemberton, and I would ask that you refrain from repeating unsubstantiated claims in the future, particularly about someone who is not present to properly defend herself in the usual social circles where such rumors tend to spread. The rebuke, delivered with quiet precision, left Lady Pemberton with little room to respond. She offered a stiff nod and retreated, though not without a final, poisonous glance in Alara's direction. Margaret remained, her expression caught between fury and calculation. Your Grace, I only wish to protect you from what exactly? Alaric's gaze settled on her, cool and direct. From a young woman who has shown nothing but honesty since the moment I met her. I find myself curious, Mrs. Whitmore, why you seem so determined to characterize your own stepdaughter in such an unflattering light. One might almost wonder what you fear she could take from you, simply by being seen clearly. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed again, no ready response available to her. For the first time that evening, Alara watched her stepmother struggle to maintain her composure, the careful mask slipping just enough to reveal the calculation underneath. Nearby, Charlotte had drawn close enough to overhear the exchange, her expression caught somewhere between shock and something else, something that looked almost like relief at seeing her mother's schemes finally meet resistance. She said nothing, not yet willing to openly contradict Margaret in front of so many watching eyes, but her silence carried a different weight than it had earlier in the evening. She was, for the first time, truly considering what her mother's ambitions had cost the girl who had grown up beside her, treated as family in name only. A few guests nearby had begun to take notice of the tension gathering in the corner, exchanging curious glances and lowered whispers of their own. Word of the Duke's dance with the household's overlooked stepdaughter had already begun spreading through the ballroom, and this new, sharper confrontation only added fuel to a fire that would likely burn through every drawing room in the county by morning. I have said all I intend to say on the matter, Margaret said finally, her voice tight. Alara, we are leaving, now. Alara felt the old, familiar instinct to obey rising automatically within her, 3 years of practiced compliance pulling at her, despite everything that had happened tonight. But something else rose alongside it, something steadier and more determined than she had felt in a very long time. I am not ready to leave, she said quietly, though her voice did not waver. Margaret's eyes widened slightly, clearly unprepared for open defiance. Alara, I have done nothing wrong tonight, Alara continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. I answered a question honestly. I danced when I was asked to dance. I have broken no rule of propriety, and I will not be dragged away simply because my presence has become inconvenient to your plans. A tense silence fell over the small gathering, broken only by the distant sound of music and laughter from elsewhere in the ballroom. Margaret's expression cycled rapidly through fury, calculation, and something that might have been the first genuine flicker of uncertainty Alara had seen from her in years. We will discuss this at home, Margaret said finally, her voice low and dangerous, before turning and disappearing back into the crowd, leaving Alara standing alone with the Duke amid the wreckage of a confrontation that had shifted something fundamental between them. Alara watched her stepmother go, her heart still racing, half expecting the ballroom floor to give way beneath her at any moment. She had never spoken to Margaret with such open defiance before, not once in 3 long years, and some small, frightened part of her waited for the consequences to arrive immediately, swift and certain. When nothing happened, when the music continued and the candles burned steadily on, she allowed herself a single unsteady breath of relief. Are you all right? Alaric asked quietly, once Margaret had gone. I do not know, Alara admitted, her hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. I have never spoken to her that way before. I do not know what will happen when we return home tonight. Something fierce and protective flickered across Alaric's face. You will not be returning to that house tonight. Not until I understand exactly what kind of treatment you have endured there, and what can be done to ensure it does not continue. Your Grace, you cannot simply... I can, and I intend to, he said, his voice firm despite its gentleness. Whatever consequences tonight brings, Ilara, I will not stand by and allow you to walk back into harm because propriety demands I look away. I have watched enough tonight to understand that something in that household is deeply wrong, and I do not intend to ignore it simply because it is inconvenient to address. Your Grace, I appreciate what you are trying to do, Ilara said carefully, but I must return home eventually. This is not a fairy tale where a single evening changes everything. Margaret is still my guardian, at least in the eyes of the law, and there are limits to what even a duke's intervention can undo. Perhaps, Alaric said, but there are also limits to what I am willing to simply watch happen, Ilara, now that I have seen it clearly. Tonight, at the very least, you will not return to that house while tempers are running this high. I will have my own carriage take you to my mother's residence nearby. She keeps a companion, an older woman entirely respectable, who can look after you for the night. Tomorrow, once matters have settled, we can determine what comes next with clearer heads. Ilara hesitated, torn between the pull of his offer and the deep, ingrained caution that years in Margaret's household had carved into her. Your mother will surely have questions about why a serving girl from tonight's ball has suddenly appeared on her doorstep. My mother, Alaric said, the faintest hint of dry humor entering his voice for the first time that evening, has spent 30 years wishing I would show even the smallest interest in anyone at these tiresome gatherings. I suspect she will ask a great many questions, yes, but I do not think you need fear her judgment. Despite everything, a small, surprised laugh escaped Ilara, quickly stifled but not quickly enough to go unnoticed. Alaric's expression softened at the sound of it, something warm passing briefly across his usually guarded features. There, he said quietly, that is the first time you have laughed all evening. I find I would like to hear it again, under better circumstances than these. You may have to wait some time for that, Your Grace. Tonight has not left much room for laughter. Then we will simply have to make room for it, he said, starting tomorrow, if you will allow me the chance. Ilara looked toward the ballroom's grand entrance, where Margaret and Charlotte had disappeared into the crowd, likely already constructing whatever version of tonight's events would serve them best by morning. She thought of Nathaniel, still watching quietly from the servant's side of the room, his loyalty steady and unwavering even now. She thought of the years of careful invisibility she had built around herself, brick by brick, and how quickly a single evening had begun to dismantle walls she had once believed permanent. Very well, she said finally. I accept your offer, Your Grace. Tonight, at least, I will not go home. Ilara looked at him, this steady, unexpected man who had somehow, in the span of a single evening, seen more of her true self than anyone had bothered to notice in years. She did not know what came next, could not begin to guess how the night would end, or what price she might yet pay for everything that had already happened. But for the first time in a very long while, she found she was not entirely afraid of finding out. The Duchess's residence was smaller than the grand estate where the ball had taken place, but no less elegant, with warm firelight glowing through tall windows as the carriage drew up the drive. Ilara sat stiffly beside Alaric, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, still processing the strange, sudden turn her evening had taken. You are quiet, Alaric observed. I am trying to understand how I came to be riding in a duke's carriage after being sent to a ball in a borrowed shawl and a torn gown, Ilara admitted. Forgive me if I am struggling to keep pace with tonight's events. A faint smile touched his mouth. I confess I am struggling with much the same thing. The Dowager Duchess, a sharp-eyed woman named Lady Constance Vane, met them in the entrance hall, with an expression of open curiosity that softened almost immediately into something kinder once she took in Ilara's worn appearance and evident exhaustion. So, the Duchess said, studying Ilara with the practiced assessment of a woman who had spent decades reading character at a glance. This is the young woman who finally managed to hold my son's attention for an entire evening. I confess I am relieved. I had begun to wonder whether he possessed a heart at all, beneath all that careful composure. Mother, Alaric said, a note of warning in his voice, though it lacked any real heat. Hush, I am allowed my opinions in my own home. The Duchess turned back to Ilara, her expression gentling further. You look as though you have had a very long evening, child. Come, sit by the fire, and I will have tea brought. My son can explain the particulars while you warm yourself properly. Over tea, Alaric explained, briefly and carefully, the events of the evening, from Ilara's arrival in servant's dress, to Lady Pemberton's poisonous accusations, to Margaret's furious departure. The Duchess listened without interruption, her expression growing steadily more troubled as the details unfolded. This will not do, she said finally, once Alaric had finished. A young woman treated as unpaid labor in her own father's household, denied even the basic dignity of proper clothing, subjected to public humiliation and slander in the same evening. It is a disgrace, and I do not use that word lightly. I did not wish to burden anyone with the full details, Ilara said quietly. It has simply been the way things are since my father's passing. I learned to manage. Managing is not the same as being cared for, the Duchess said firmly. There is a difference, and I suspect you have gone far too long without anyone drawing the distinction for you. Ilara did not know how to respond to that kindness, so entirely unfamiliar after 3 years of careful indifference. She lowered her eyes to her teacup, blinking back an unexpected sting of tears. You will stay here tonight, the Duchess continued, her tone leaving no room for argument. Tomorrow, we will determine what steps might properly be taken, both regarding your situation at home and regarding whatever foolish rumors Lady Pemberton has undoubtedly already begun spreading through half the county by now. Your Grace, I could not possibly impose. Nonsense. You will impose exactly as much as necessary, and I will hear no further argument on the matter. The Duchess's sharp eyes softened again, just slightly. My son does not bring young women home to meet me, Miss Whitmore. Not once, in all his years. Whatever tonight has set in motion, I do not intend to let it wither, for lack of proper support. Later that evening, once the Duchess had retired and the household had grown quiet, Ilara found herself standing at the window of her borrowed chamber, looking out over the dark garden below. The events of the day still felt unreal, as though she might wake at any moment back in her narrow room at Margaret's house, the shawl and the torn gown and the whole strange evening nothing more than a vivid, foolish dream. A soft knock came at the door. She opened it to find Alaric standing in the corridor, still dressed, his expression thoughtful. I did not mean to disturb you, he said. I saw the light beneath your door and wondered if you were resting well. I am not certain I know how to rest, after a day like today, Ilara admitted. Everything has happened so quickly. Yesterday morning I was mending curtains in Margaret's sitting room. Tonight I am standing in a duke's household, wearing a borrowed gown, being defended against accusations I never imagined facing. Life has a way of changing course without warning, Alaric said. I confess, I did not expect to find myself so thoroughly occupied by a single evening's acquaintance either, and yet here we are. Ilara studied him for a long moment. Why does this matter so much to you, truly? You could have let the evening end with a single dance and a pleasant memory. Instead, you have brought me into your mother's home, defended my character before witnesses, and now stand ready to confront half the county on my behalf. It is a great deal of trouble for someone you have known for less than a full day. Alaric was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I have spent years watching people perform for my benefit, Ilara. Every conversation calculated, every kindness measured against what it might earn in return. I had begun to believe that was simply how the world worked, that genuine connection was something reserved for stories rather than real life. Then I met a woman in a torn gown, carrying a tray of drinks, who spoke to me with more honesty in a few sentences than I have received in years of careful courtship. I am not troubled by the trouble, if that answers your question. I would find it far more troubling to have said nothing and let the evening pass unremarked. Ilara felt something warm and unfamiliar settle in her chest, a feeling she did not yet trust herself to name. You are a strange sort of duke, your grace. So I am frequently told, he said, the ghost of a smile touching his mouth. I have decided to consider it a compliment, regardless of how it is intended. They stood together a moment longer in comfortable silence, the events of the day settling slowly around them, before Alaric bid her good night and withdrew down the corridor. Ilara closed her door softly, her heart still unsteady, and finally allowed herself to believe, just a little, that tomorrow might bring something other than disaster. That night, Ilara slept in a guest chamber larger and finer than any room she had occupied since her father's death, beneath blankets that smelled of lavender rather than dust, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept soundly, without the familiar knot of dread that usually accompanied the ending of each day. The following morning brought less peaceful developments. Word had indeed spread quickly through the county overnight, exactly as the Duchess predicted. By the time Ilara came downstairs, dressed in a borrowed gown far finer than anything she owned, the household had already received 3 separate callers, eager to confirm or deny the various rumors circulating about the previous evening's events. It seems half the county believes you seduced the Duke through some elaborate scheme, the Duchess said dryly, setting aside a letter she had been reading with visible distaste. The other half believes you rescued him from a marriage to that dreadful Whitmore girl, through nothing short of divine intervention. Neither version bears much resemblance to what actually happened, of course, but gossip rarely concerns itself with accuracy. This is precisely what I feared, Alara said, her stomach tightening with anxiety. Margaret warned me that speaking with the Duke would bring consequences. I did not expect them to unfold quite this publicly. Consequences were always going to follow, one way or another, Alaric said, entering the room with a grim expression that suggested he had received unwelcome news of his own. Lady Pemberton has apparently decided to press her claims further. She has written to several prominent families this morning, repeating and expanding upon her accusations from last night. What sort of accusations precisely? The Duchess asked sharply. That Alara has a history of deception, that she deliberately engineered last night's encounter to trap me into an advantageous match, and that her stepmother has documented proof of previous, similar schemes. Alaric's jaw tightened. It is nonsense, of course. But nonsense repeated often enough, and by enough respectable voices, has a way of hardening into accepted truth. Alara felt the floor shift beneath her, the fragile hope of the previous evening curdling into something closer to panic. If this spreads unchecked, my reputation will be ruined beyond repair. Regardless of whether any of it is true, no respectable household will employ me. I will have nothing left. It will not come to that, Alaric said firmly, though Alara could see the concern beneath his composed exterior. I will not allow it. You cannot simply command gossip to stop, Your Grace, however much authority you carry, Alara said, her voice tight with rising desperation. These are matters of reputation, of whispered conversation in drawing rooms I will never be invited into. There is very little a title can do against that kind of quiet, persistent poison. A tense silence settled over the room, broken finally by the sound of the front door and raised voices in the entrance hall. A moment later, a servant appeared, looking flustered. Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but there are 2 visitors requesting to see Miss Whitmore, a Mr. Nathaniel Cross and Miss Charlotte Whitmore. Alara's breath caught. Charlotte is here? Show them in, the Duchess said, her curiosity evidently piqued. Nathaniel entered first, his expression a mixture of relief and lingering worry as his eyes found Alara, confirming for himself that she was safe and unharmed. Behind him came Charlotte, uncharacteristically subdued, her fine morning dress slightly rumpled as though she had dressed in haste. Alara, Nathaniel said, crossing the room quickly. Thank goodness. We heard what Lady Pemberton has been saying. I could not simply sit by and do nothing. How did you even know where to find me? Alara asked. Edmund, Nathaniel said. He overheard the Duke's instructions last night regarding the carriage. I hope you do not mind that I came. I am glad you did, Alara said, and meant it entirely. Charlotte stepped forward hesitantly, her eyes darting nervously between Alara, Nathaniel, and the Duke, clearly uncomfortable in the unfamiliar surroundings. Alara, I know we have never been close. I know my mother has treated you unfairly for years, and I have said nothing, done nothing, simply allowed it to continue because speaking against her felt dangerous, or difficult, or simply easier to avoid. Charlotte. Please, let me finish. Charlotte took a steadying breath. I heard what Lady Pemberton is claiming this morning, and I know it to be false. I was there last night. I saw the Duke seek you out, not the other way around. I saw you try, repeatedly, to remain in the background exactly as my mother instructed. None of what is being said reflects what actually happened, and I cannot in good conscience allow a lie to destroy your reputation when I know the truth. The room fell silent, everyone present absorbing the unexpected weight of Charlotte's words. Your mother will not be pleased, Alara said quietly. No, Charlotte agreed, something steely entering her voice for the first time. She will not. But I find, this morning, that I am rather tired of arranging my entire life around what pleases my mother, particularly when doing so requires standing silently by, while someone else is treated so unjustly. The Duchess, who had been observing the exchange with sharp, evaluating eyes, finally spoke. This is precisely the kind of first-hand account we need. Miss Whitmore, if you are willing to state publicly what you witnessed last night, and what you know of the conditions in your mother's household, it would go a considerable way towards silencing Lady Pemberton's claims before they cause any lasting damage. Charlotte hesitated only briefly. I am willing. My mother's anger is a small price to pay, compared to the price Alara has already paid for far too long. Alaric, who had been watching the exchange with quiet intensity, finally spoke. There is a gathering planned at Lord Ashford's residence tomorrow evening, one that most of the same families who heard Lady Pemberton's accusations will be attending. If the truth were to be spoken there, clearly and publicly, it would reach exactly the audience that needs to hear it. You mean to confront this directly, the Duchess said, approval evident in her tone, in front of the very people spreading the rumors. I mean to ensure that Alara's character is never again subject to the kind of careless slander it endured last night, Alaric said, his gaze finding Alara's across the room, steady and resolute. If she is willing to face it, I intend to stand beside her while the truth is finally spoken plainly, for everyone to hear. Alara looked around the room, at Nathaniel's quiet, unwavering loyalty, at Charlotte's unexpected and hard-won courage, at the Duchess's fierce protectiveness, and at Alaric's steady, unwavering resolve. For 3 years, she had faced every hardship alone, learning to expect nothing from anyone, learning that hope was simply another word for disappointment waiting to happen. Tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not alone at all. I am willing, she said quietly, though her voice carried a new and unfamiliar strength. Whatever tomorrow brings, I would rather face it honestly than continue hiding from a lie. That afternoon, once Nathaniel and Charlotte had departed, the Duchess drew Alara aside for a quiet conversation of her own, away from the others. I want you to understand something, child, the Duchess said, settling into a chair beside the fire and gesturing for Alara to join her. My son does not act on impulse. He has spent years guarding himself carefully against exactly the kind of scheming and flattery that surrounds a man in his position. Whatever he feels for you, it did not arrive lightly, and I do not believe it will fade quickly either. I do not know what to do with that knowledge, Your Grace, Alara admitted. I have spent 3 years learning to expect very little from the world. It is difficult to suddenly trust that something good might simply be allowed to happen, without some hidden cost waiting to reveal itself. That is a reasonable fear, given what you have endured, the Duchess said gently. But I would ask you to consider this. Fear kept you safe in your stepmother's household. Yes, small and careful and unnoticed. But it also kept you from ever being fully seen, fully valued, for as long as you allowed it to guide you. Tomorrow evening, you will have a choice before you. Whether to continue guarding yourself so carefully that nothing can touch you, or to risk being seen fully, faults and fears included, by people who may finally choose to value you properly for it. Alara considered the words carefully. And if I am seen fully, and still found wanting, then you will have lost nothing you truly needed to keep, the Duchess said simply. But I do not believe that is what will happen, child. I have lived a great many years, and I have learned to recognize genuine character when I see it. You possess it in abundance, whatever your stepmother has spent 3 years trying to convince you otherwise. Alara felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, the Duchess's plain, unhesitating kindness landing somewhere deep and long neglected within her. Thank you, she said softly. I do not think anyone has spoken to me so plainly, or so kindly, in a very long time. Then it is well past time someone did, the Duchess said, patting her hand briskly before rising to attend to other matters, leaving Alara alone with her thoughts and the quiet, steady warmth of the fire. As the afternoon light shifted toward evening, Alara found herself walking slowly through the Duchess's garden, turning over everything that had happened in the space of a single day. She thought of Margaret's cold fury, of Lady Pemberton's poisonous words, of Charlotte's unexpected courage, of Nathaniel's unwavering loyalty, and of Alaric's steady, patient certainty. Tomorrow evening would bring its own trials, its own risks, but for the first time in 3 long years, she found she was not facing them entirely alone, and that knowledge alone gave her more strength than she had thought herself capable of holding. Lord Ashford's residence glowed with candlelight when the carriage arrived the following evening, the sound of music and conversation already drifting out into the cool night air. Alara sat beside Alaric, dressed in a gown the Duchess had insisted upon providing, a deep emerald silk that fit her properly for the first time in longer than she could remember. She smoothed the fabric nervously, watching the grand entrance draw closer. You look as though you are preparing for battle, Alaric observed. In a sense, I suppose I am, Alara said. Only instead of swords, the weapons tonight will be whispered words and knowing glances. Then it is fortunate you have never once needed rescuing from a battle of wits, he said. I have watched you hold your own against far sharper attacks than anything Lady Pemberton is likely to attempt tonight. The carriage drew to a stop, and Alaric helped her down, offering his arm as they climbed the wide stone steps toward the entrance. Alara felt the weight of curious stares the moment they crossed the threshold, whispered conversations pausing and resuming in their wake as guests recognized her from the previous night's scandal. Margaret and Charlotte were already present, standing near the edge of the ballroom. Margaret's expression tightened visibly at the sight of Alara on the Duke's arm, though she quickly composed herself into something more socially acceptable. Charlotte, by contrast, offered a small, genuine smile of encouragement. Lady Pemberton spotted them almost immediately, moving through the crowd with the confident air of a woman certain of her own authority. "Your Grace," she said smoothly, "I see you have continued your association with Miss Whitmore, despite my earlier concerns." "You mean despite your earlier accusations," Alaric corrected, his tone calm but pointed. "Concerns imply some basis in fact. What you offered last night was something else entirely." A ripple of interested murmurs spread through the nearby guests, drawn by the tension in his voice. Lady Pemberton's composure flickered, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge in front of witnesses. "I only repeated what I had been told," she said stiffly. "By whom precisely?" Alaric asked. "I would very much like to know the source of claims serious enough to threaten a young woman's entire reputation." Lady Pemberton's eyes flicked almost involuntarily toward Margaret, who stood frozen a short distance away, her carefully maintained composure beginning to show visible strain. "It does not matter," Lady Pemberton said quickly. "The matter of her character remains in question, regardless of the source." "Does it?" Alaric's voice carried clearly now, drawing the attention of even more guests, the ballroom's usual chatter beginning to quiet, as more people turned to observe the unfolding confrontation. "Because I have spent the better part of 2 days investigating precisely that question, Lady Pemberton, and I have found nothing whatsoever to support your claims. What I have found instead is a young woman who has endured 3 years of unjust treatment in her own household, treatment that has apparently gone unremarked because it was easier for everyone involved to look away." A gentleman standing nearby, an older man Alara did not recognize, leaned toward his companion and murmured something about the impropriety of airing household matters so publicly. His companion, a woman with sharp, curious eyes, shushed him quickly, clearly far more interested in hearing what would come next than in observing the usual rules of polite restraint. Word of the previous night's dance had already traveled through every fashionable drawing room in the county, and now, it seemed, the county itself had gathered to witness whatever followed. Ilara felt her heart pounding as every eye in the ballroom turned toward her. This was the moment the Duchess had spoken of, the choice between remaining carefully hidden or standing fully exposed before people who might yet choose to judge her unfairly. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt beneath it. "I would like to speak, if I may." The room fell further into silence, guests drawing closer, curiosity overcoming propriety. 3 years ago my father died, Ilara began. Since then I have lived in my stepmother's household, where I have been treated, in practice if not in name, as unpaid staff rather than family. I have mended gowns I was never permitted to wear. I have prepared meals I was often not permitted to share. I have not spoken of this before now because I believed, foolishly perhaps, that silence was safer than the consequences of speaking honestly. She glanced briefly toward Margaret, whose face had gone pale, her composure entirely abandoned now. 2 nights ago, I attended this same gathering's counterpart, sent in a torn gown as punishment for a minor grievance, instructed to remain invisible among the serving staff. I did not seek out the Duke's attention. I did not scheme or manipulate to gain his notice. I answered honestly when he spoke to me, and for that honesty, I have since been accused of deception, of manipulation, of character flaws that exist nowhere except in the imagination of someone determined to protect a false narrative. Charlotte stepped forward suddenly, drawing surprised glances from the assembled guests. "I can confirm every word," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her mother's sharp, warning glare. "I was present both nights. I witnessed the Duke seek Ilara out, not the reverse. I witnessed my mother's efforts to separate them, to send Ilara home early, to prevent any connection from forming. Everything Ilara has said is true, and I am ashamed it has taken me this long to say so publicly." "Charlotte," Margaret hissed, though her voice had lost much of its earlier authority. "No, Mother." Charlotte's voice remained firm, though Ilara could see the effort it cost her. "I have stayed silent for years, while Ilara was treated unfairly in our home, because speaking against you felt dangerous, or disloyal, or simply too difficult. I will not stay silent any longer, not when the cost of my silence is watching someone else's reputation destroyed by lies I know to be false." A heavy silence fell over the ballroom, broken only by the faint sound of music continuing somewhere in the background, forgotten by the crowd now fully absorbed in the unfolding scene. Margaret stood frozen, her carefully constructed world visibly crumbling around her, the calculated performance of decades finally stripped away in front of the very society she had spent her life trying to impress. Lady Pemberton, sensing the shifting mood of the crowd, attempted one final effort to salvage her position. "Even if what you say is true regarding the household matter, she said, addressing Alara directly for the first time. It does not necessarily follow that every claim regarding your conduct with gentlemen is false. Then produce your evidence, Alaric said sharply, before Alara could respond. Name a single gentleman, name a single instance. I have asked you this once already, Lady Pemberton, and you offered nothing beyond vague insinuation. I will not allow a woman's character to be dismantled on the strength of insinuation alone, not in my presence, and not while I have breath to object to it. Lady Pemberton's mouth opened, then closed. No answer forthcoming. The silence stretched, damning in its own right, and several guests nearby exchanged pointed glances, clearly drawing their own conclusions about the true worth of the accusations that had circulated so freely over the past 2 days. I believe, said an older woman standing nearby, one of the county's more respected matriarchs, that we have all heard quite enough to understand where the truth actually lies this evening. She turned a cool, appraising look toward Lady Pemberton. I would be more careful, in future, about repeating claims one cannot substantiate. Reputations are fragile things, and it seems tonight has demonstrated rather clearly how easily they can be wrongly damaged by careless tongues. Lady Pemberton, thoroughly outmaneuvered and increasingly aware of the crowd's shifting sympathy, offered a stiff, wordless nod and withdrew toward the edges of the room, her earlier confidence entirely deflated. Alaric stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests before settling firmly on Alara. I believe the truth has now been spoken plainly enough for anyone still harboring doubts. Alara Whitmore is a young woman of considerable honesty, courage, and character, treated unjustly by those who should have protected her, and slandered further by those who valued gossip over truth. I do not intend to let either injustice continue unaddressed. He turned fully to face her, and something in his expression shifted, softened, grew suddenly and unmistakably earnest. The surrounding crowd seemed to sense the shift as well, conversations dying away entirely, as every eye in the ballroom fixed upon the two of them. Alara, Alaric said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. I have known you for only 2 days, and yet in that short time, you have shown me more genuine honesty and courage than I have encountered in years of careful, calculated society. I do not offer what I am about to offer lightly, nor do I offer it out of pity or obligation. I offer it because I find, quite simply, that I do not wish to spend another day without you beside me. He knelt, drawing a soft, collective gasp from the surrounding guests. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? For a moment, Alara could not speak at all, the weight of the question, and everything it represented, settling over her like warm sunlight after a long, bitter winter. She thought of 3 years of quiet endurance, of borrowed shawls and torn gowns, of a father's promise never kept, of every small cruelty she had learned to absorb without complaint. She thought of Nathaniel's steady loyalty, of Charlotte's hard-won courage, of the Duchess's fierce, unhesitating kindness, and of this man before her, who had seen her clearly from the very first evening, and had never once looked away. Yes, she said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion, though her certainty remained unshaken. Yes, I will. The ballroom erupted into astonished murmurs and scattered applause as Alaric rose and drew her gently into an embrace, careless of the watching crowd, careless of propriety, caring only for the woman before him who had finally, after 3 long years, been seen and valued exactly as she deserved. Margaret did not stay to witness the celebration that followed. She slipped from the ballroom quietly, her schemes and careful calculations undone entirely by a single evening's honest reckoning. Her authority over Alara's life ended as swiftly and completely as it had once seemed unbreakable. Nathaniel, watching from near the edge of the crowd, felt a complicated tangle of emotions settle in his chest. Joy for Alara's happiness intertwined with a quiet, private ache he did not allow himself to dwell upon. He caught her eye across the room, and she offered him a small, grateful smile, one that acknowledged, without words, everything he had done for her over the years, every quiet kindness that had helped carry her through the darkest of them. He smiled back, genuine despite the ache, content to have played whatever small part he had in bringing her to this moment. Charlotte approached her stepsister once the initial excitement had settled, her expression uncertain. I hope you know I meant every word tonight, she said. I am sorry it took me so long to say it. I know, Alara said, and found that she meant the forgiveness in her voice entirely. Thank you, Charlotte, for tonight, and for finally choosing to see me clearly. The two women embraced, a small, quiet reconciliation amid the ballroom's continuing celebration, 3 years of distance beginning, slowly, to close. As the evening wore on, Elara stood beside Alaric near the same tall windows where they had first properly spoken 2 nights before, watching the candlelit ballroom continue its celebration around them. She thought of the girl who had arrived at that first ball in a torn gown, expecting nothing, hoping for even less, and marveled quietly at how completely her world had shifted in the span of a few short days. "You are thinking very seriously about something," Alaric observed, his hand finding hers. "I am thinking that 3 days ago, I believed I understood exactly what my life would be, for as long as Margaret controlled it," Elara said softly. "I never imagined anything different was possible. And now?" "Now," she said, looking up at him with a smile that held none of the careful guardedness she had worn for 3 long years, "I find I am no longer afraid to imagine what comes next." The Duchess found her a short while later, standing quietly near the terrace doors while Alaric spoke with a small cluster of well-wishers eager to offer their congratulations. "Well," the Duchess said, coming to stand beside her, "I believe that went rather better than I had dared to hope." "I still can hardly believe it happened at all," Elara admitted. 2 days ago I was mending curtains. Tonight I am engaged to a duke, in front of half the county, after publicly confronting the woman who raised me. "Life has a curious sense of timing," the Duchess said. "But I do not think tonight was luck, child. I think it was simply the truth, finally given room to be heard, after being buried for far too long beneath other people's convenience." She studied Elara for a moment, her sharp eyes softening. "You did well tonight. Better than well. I have watched a great many young women navigate difficult rooms over the years, and few have done so with the honesty and composure you managed, under circumstances considerably more trying than most ever face." "I had help," Elara said. "Yours, and Charlotte's, and Nathaniel's, and Alaric's. I do not think I could have stood there alone and said what needed saying." "Perhaps not," the Duchess agreed. "But you were the one who chose to speak, when silence would have been so much easier. That courage was entirely your own, and I hope you will remember that, in the years ahead, whenever you find yourself doubting your own strength." Elara felt tears prick at her eyes again, the second time in as many days that this sharp, kind woman had managed to reach some carefully guarded place within her that had gone untended for far too long. "Thank you, Your Grace, for everything. You will call me Constance, soon enough," the Duchess said, a faint smile touching her mouth. "It seems we are shortly to be family, after all." Later, as the celebration continued around them, Alaric found Elara again, near the terrace doors, drawing her gently outside into the cool night air, away from the noise and press of well-wishers. "Regretting your decision already?" he asked, a note of teasing warmth in his voice, though something more serious lingered beneath it. "Never," Elara said, and found she meant it entirely. "I am simply trying to understand how to hold so much happiness at once, after so many years of holding so little." "Perhaps you do not need to understand it," Alaric said gently. "Perhaps you simply need to let yourself have it, without searching for the catch you have learned to expect in every good thing." Elara considered this for a long moment, looking out over the dark garden below, the same view she had first shared with him 2 nights before, when she had been nothing more than a serving girl in a borrowed shawl, and he had been a duke she assumed she would never speak to again. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to try. That is all I ask," he said, drawing her hand gently into his. "Just that you try, and let the rest unfold as it will." They stood together in comfortable silence, the music and laughter drifting faintly from the ballroom behind them, the stars bright and steady overhead. Elara thought of her father, of the promise he had made so long ago about balls and music and evenings exactly like this one, a promise he had not lived to keep. She liked to think, standing there in the cool night air beside a man who had seen her clearly from the very first evening, that he would have been glad to know it had finally been kept after all, even if the path to keeping it had wound through years of hardship neither of them could have anticipated. Inside, the celebration continued long into the night, but for Elara, the truest and most important moment had already passed, quiet and private, shared beneath a canopy of stars with the man who had chosen to see her, fully and honestly, when the rest of the world had so long chosen to look away. Outside, the night stretched on, clear and quiet beneath a sky full of stars, and inside the glowing warmth of the ballroom, Elara Whitmore stood exactly where she belonged at last, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, finally and fully seen. 6 months had passed since the night Elara Whitmore stood in Lord Ashford's ballroom and spoke the truth of her own life aloud for the first time in 3 long years. The wedding had taken place in early spring, A quiet, joyful affair attended by far fewer guests than the grand society weddings the county was accustomed to, exactly as Alara had wished. She had not wanted spectacle. She had wanted only the people who had earned a place in her new life. The Duchess, now simply Constance to her, had stood proudly near the front of the small chapel, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and pretending, unconvincingly, that she was not weeping. Charlotte had attended as well, seated beside Nathaniel, the two of them having formed an unexpected friendship in the months since that first difficult confrontation, bonded by their shared history and their shared loyalty to the bride. Margaret had not been invited. It was not cruelty that kept her away, Alara told herself often in the months that followed, but simple honesty. Some wounds required more time to heal than a single wedding day could offer, and Alara had learned, finally, that she did not owe anyone forgiveness delivered on a timeline convenient to them. Margaret had written once, a stiff, formal letter offering something that resembled an apology without ever quite committing to the word itself. Alara had read it carefully, folded it away, and decided she was not yet ready to respond. Perhaps someday she would be. For now, the distance felt necessary, and she no longer apologized to herself for needing it. She thought of Margaret sometimes, in quiet, unguarded moments, and found the feelings that surfaced more complicated than simple anger. There was grief there, too. Grief for the stepmother she had once hoped, foolishly perhaps, might someday come to care for her properly. There was relief at no longer needing to brace herself each morning against whatever cruelty the day might bring. And there was, underneath it all, a strange, reluctant understanding that Margaret's own fears and failures had shaped her choices as much as any genuine malice had. Understanding did not require forgiveness, Alara had come to realize. It simply required honesty, and she had grown considerably more comfortable with honesty since the night she first spoke it plainly in a crowded ballroom. Life as a duchess had proven, in many ways, entirely different from anything Alara had imagined during those long years of quiet servitude. She had expected grandeur, certainly, the fine gowns and elegant rooms she now called her own, but she had not expected how much of her new life would be spent simply being asked her opinion, being consulted on household matters, being treated as though her thoughts carried genuine weight. It was a small thing, perhaps, to someone who had never known otherwise, but to Alara, who had spent 3 years being told, in ways large and small, that her thoughts mattered very little at all, it felt like nothing short of a revelation. She had used some of her newfound position to establish a modest fund, quietly and without fanfare, intended to assist young women in situations similar to her own former circumstances, women left vulnerable by the deaths of fathers or husbands, dependent on the goodwill of relatives who did not always extend it fairly. Alaric had supported the endeavor fully, understanding without needing lengthy explanation why it mattered so deeply to her. "You do not have to carry the weight of every difficult household in the county," he told her one evening, finding her bent over a stack of letters requesting assistance, her expression thoughtful and slightly overwhelmed. "I know," Alara said, "but I remember what it felt like to have no one looking out for me. If I can be that person for even a few others, I think it is worth the effort." Alaric had said nothing further, only pressed a gentle kiss to her temple and settled beside her, to help sort through the remaining letters, exactly the sort of quiet, steady partnership she had come to rely upon in the months since their wedding. Nathaniel had eventually found his own happiness as well, though it had taken him longer than most to allow himself to look for it. He had remained close to the family, taking on greater responsibility within the estate's management, and had, quite unexpectedly, begun a slow, careful courtship with one of Constance's companions, a thoughtful, quiet woman named Eliza, who had joined the household shortly after Alara's wedding. Alara watched the tentative romance unfold with quiet satisfaction, grateful that the man who had shown her such steady kindness for so many years had finally found someone willing to return it in equal measure. She had asked him once, gently, whether it pained him to watch her marry another man after so many years of quiet devotion. Nathaniel had considered the question seriously before answering. In the honest, unguarded way that had always characterized their friendship, it did, for a time, he admitted. "I will not pretend otherwise, not with you. But watching you find happiness, real and lasting happiness, after everything you endured, has brought me a satisfaction that outweighs whatever quiet disappointment I once carried. I would rather see you loved properly by someone else than see you settle for less, simply to spare my feelings." Alara had embraced him then, grateful beyond words for a friendship that had survived every complication life had placed in its path, and grateful, too, that he had finally found his own path toward happiness, separate from her own but no less deserved. Charlotte, too, had changed considerably in the months since that difficult evening at Lord Ashford's ball. Freed gradually from her mother's controlling influence, she had begun to discover interests entirely her own, taking up painting with genuine enthusiasm, and speaking, for the first time in her life, of wanting a marriage built on genuine affection rather than strategic advantage. She visited often, and the two stepsisters had built, slowly and carefully, something that finally resembled real sisterhood, unburdened by the old resentments and unequal treatment that had once stood between them. During one such visit, Charlotte brought with her a small, careful painting she had completed, a rendering of the garden behind their childhood home, softened and warmed in a way the actual house had rarely felt in the years since their father's death. "I wanted you to have something from before everything changed," Charlotte said, a little uncertain as she handed it over. "Something that remembers the good parts, if there were any worth remembering." Elara studied the painting for a long moment, surprised by the sudden rise of emotion it stirred in her. "There were good parts," she said finally. "I had simply forgotten how to look for them, for a long while. Thank you, Charlotte. This means more than you know." The two women had spoken since, at length, about their father, about the years before Margaret's second marriage had reshaped the household so thoroughly, and Elara found, to her quiet surprise, that these conversations brought her a measure of healing she had not realized she still needed. Charlotte remembered details of their father that Elara herself had begun to lose, small habits and phrases and quiet kindnesses, and piecing these fragments back together felt, in its own way, like recovering something precious she had feared lost entirely. One warm evening in early autumn, Elara stood once again on a terrace much like the one where she and Alaric had first properly spoken. Though this terrace belonged to their own estate now, the gardens below tended with the same careful attention Elara had once given to mending gowns she was never permitted to wear. Alaric found her there, as he often did, drawn by some quiet instinct to seek her out whenever a rare private moment presented itself. "You are thinking of that first night again," he said, not quite a question. "I am," Elara admitted. "I do, sometimes, when the evening grows quiet like this. It seems impossible looking back, that so much could have changed from a single ball, a single dance, a single honest conversation. I do not think it was quite so simple as a single evening," Alaric said, coming to stand beside her. "I think it was 3 years of quiet strength, finally given the chance to be seen. The evening simply provided the opportunity. You provided everything else." Elara leaned into him, watching the last light of evening fade slowly over the garden, and felt, not for the first time, the deep and settled gratitude of a woman who had once expected nothing from her life, and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, been given everything that mattered most. "I used to think happiness was something that happened to other people," she said softly. "Something reserved for those who had not learned, as I had, exactly how little the world sometimes offers. And now? Now I think happiness is simply the truth, finally given room to breathe," she said. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain it has all the room it needs." She thought, too, of the small, ragged shawl Nathaniel had given her on that first difficult evening, the one small kindness that had carried her through hours of humiliation before anything else had begun to shift. She still kept it, tucked carefully away in a drawer in her private chambers, a quiet reminder of how far a single act of unasked-for kindness could reach, rippling outward through a life in ways impossible to predict at the time it was offered. She had never told Alaric quite how much that shawl still meant to her, but she suspected, from the gentle way he sometimes looked at her when the subject of that first evening arose, that he understood regardless. Alaric drew her closer, and together they watched the stars begin to emerge over the quiet garden below, two people who had found, against every unlikely odd, exactly the life they had once believed themselves unworthy of receiving. Behind them, the house glowed warm with candlelight, filled with the sounds of a household built not on obligation or careful performance, but on genuine care, hard-won honesty, and the simple, steady comfort of finally, truly belonging. Inside, faint laughter drifted from the drawing room, where Charlotte and Nathaniel had gathered with Constance for an evening of quiet conversation, the household's newest small tradition. Elara listened for a moment, smiling softly at the warm, familiar sound of it, before turning her attention back to the man beside her, and the vast, star-filled sky stretching out above them both. "Shall we join them?" Alaric asked eventually. "In a moment," Elara said, content simply to remain a little longer in the quiet, gathering peace of the evening, grateful beyond measure for every small, ordinary happiness that had once seemed entirely beyond her reach.